For all of the videos thus far, we've been looking at the binding engine from the perspective of the view and view base, but this is great if I've got a view, but can I get the same functionality from a component? So I want to create a custom component that has all of that translation functionality, binding functionality, auto cleanup functionality. How can I do that? The good news is that yes, you can. Here is a custom component that we're creating. You can see that we use custom elements to define as per usual. We pointed to a class. It's what the class inherits from that differs. In this case, it's CRS binding classes bindable element. And what bindable element does is it allows you to create custom components that has all of the binding capabilities and functionality built in. So on the left hand side we are looking at the view model, and on the right hand side we are looking at the view. And when looking at the view, you can see that we have the translation bindings happening on the inputs, on the label divs, and then on the inputs we have stock standard value bindings happening as well. Looking at the page, you can see here on the Elements tab that we have our custom component. It has the standard HTML as we have defined within the custom web component, and everything works as expected. In the web component, on the preload, we set the first name, last name, and age, and you can see those values reflecting over here. So let's go and have a look at some of the finer details around defining a bindable element. Well, the first thing that we notice is that this thing automatically loads the HTML for us, but you need to tell it, where do I get the HTML from? So you have to define a read-only property. That means it only has a getter, not a setter, called HTML. The name has to be that. That's a convention within the bindable element. And in this, you need to tell it what is the path to the HTML that I should be loading. Now it can be any path, but because of the convention that we normally follow, that the JavaScript and the HTML is in the same folder, we just use the import meta URL and replace the JS with the .html because the names are exactly the same. So returning that back to the base of the bindable element will cause that to load the HTML for us and get everything up and running. As per usual, we have a connected callback and a disconnected callback, although they do change a little bit. You can see that both of them, in this case, we have an await super connected callback and await super disconnected callback. That is because there is logic happening within the bindable element to initialize the component and to also free resources of the component when it is connected to the DOM and disconnected to the DOM. So it's imperative that you remember to call the connected callback and the disconnected callback supers when you need them. You'll also notice that we have two other functions, and you might have seen them before. The preload and the load. So what do the preload and load mean, and when do they actually fire? Preload is a function that gets automatically called in any binding context, be it a view base or the bindable element, and it happens before the parsing of the HTML happens to say I want to do a once-off binding, or there's some stuff that I want to do before you pass the HTML. So the word preload means before you load this, perform these actions for me, please. Now you'll see that there's no super in here, and that's just because the underlying logic checks, do you have a preload method? And if you do have a preload method, execute it. If you don't define a preload method, it says, okay, well, there's nothing there for me to do, and it just continues with its work. Similarly, we have a load, but the load happens after we've processed the HTML, but before we set the component as being ready, right? So is there any work that you want to do after the processing has been done, the binding has happened, all the hooks have been set up, but before the component raises a ready event to say, guys, I'm ready to be used, go wild. All right, do I need to define all this stuff? The answer is no. in this example, we're not using any of this, so we can just toss that, and we don't have any of that, so we can toss that away as well. So in this case, all I really need is to write the HTML, and here I want to set my values up beforehand, so that's all I need to define in this instance. Here is the example for us again. We refresh it, we see that everything works as it is. And if we can look at our source code for our component, you can see it's just the necessary parts that we have. So important to realize that, look, I'm not doing anything special in the connected callback. I'm not doing anything special in the disconnected callback. Don't have it there. Don't have redundant functions there if you don't need it. This would conclude the summary of a bindable element, but there's more stuff on this subject to come.